Star Trek The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 9. When Professor Lupisky, looking none the worse for wear and no less crotchety, strode to the front of his class a week later, the cadets burst into applause. He waved it off, trying to look as if the display of respect was irritating him. In fact, he was extremely flattered by it, but he would hardly be inclined to let on. "So," he said in that clipped German accent for which he was so renowned, "you have been working hard, yes? During my enforced vacation, Superintendent Sulak conveyed to you my instructions for independent research." Heads bobbed all over the room. "Good. So there will be no one saying things like, 'I had not heard about it,' or 'I didn't know,' or any other such utter wastes of breath and time." Heads shook all over the room. "Very well. Famous battles, then. That would have come out differently had the Picard maneuver been put into play. Who would like to go first?" Worf raised his hand immediately, double-checking his pad notations to make certain that he had his information down correctly. He glanced over at Simon. Simon didn't have his hand raised. Typical, not wanting to jump to the forefront. "Mr. Lupisky checked his charts. "Keebron." Zach Keebron, several rows back and to the right, rose. "The first battle I chose," he said, "was the Rimber engagement near 2264. USS Farragut was confronted by 3 Klingon vessels." Slowly, Worf turned in his seat to fix Zach with as vicious a stare as he could muster. If Zach noticed, he didn't indicate it. "The Farragut sustained heavy casualties, 79 dead, 83 more injured. They managed to disable one of the 3 Klingon warships and barely escape. If, however, the captain had employed the Picard maneuver at exactly 42 seconds into the engagement, my calculations show that he could have completely destroyed 2 of the 3 Klingon war vessels. The 3rd Klingon vessel would doubtless have run at that point because, well, that's how they are." "That's how who are, Mr. Keebron?" asked Lupisky. There was a dangerous tone in his voice. "Klingons, sir. They generally run unless they outnumber their opponents 2-1. "That is a lie!" Worf fairly roared. "Mr. Worf, control yourself," Lupisky snapped, but he didn't seem any too pleased with Zach either. "Mr. Keebron, such overwhelming racial slurs will not be tolerated. With all due respect, sir," Zach said mildly, "it's not intended as such. Out of the 173 different engagements with Klingons that I studied for this report—" "You only studied Klingon skirmishes?" said Lupisky incredulously. "You mean with all the hostile species that have been encountered? Rigelians, Cardassians, Ferengi, Orions, Romulans, Tholians, Gorn. With all of them and many more, you only saw fit to study battles involving Klingons?" "I like to specialize, sir," was the calm response. "Sit down, Mr. Keebron." Lupisky's voice dropped the temperature in the room by at least 20 degrees. "Someone else, please. Mr. Briggs." Cadet Briggs now rose, and Worf suspected what was coming. He was right. "The Battle of Chernobog," began Briggs, "involved the ambush of a freighter convoy by—" "Klingons!" Lupisky cut him off. "Do you have any scenarios that did not involve a Klingon battle?" Briggs consulted his pad and pretended to look surprised. "Why, no, sir." Lupisky slowly surveyed the class. There was cold fury in his eyes. "May I ask how many people here worked up studies of battles that did not, repeat, not involve Klingons?" Worf raised his hand, as did Simon. Tanya, the only other member of their study group in the class, was in the front row. She raised her hand. Everyone else sat in stony silence. Worf rose, gathered up his pad, and headed for the exit. "Mr. Worf, I did not give you permission to leave," Lupisky called after him. Worf stopped at the door, turned, and said, "With all due respect, Professor, I did not ask your permission." And then he walked out. There was a long silence. Cadets glanced at each other, smirking slightly. Lipinski wasn't smirking. He was furious. "That," said Lipinski, "was the most abominable display I've ever seen by any Starfleet class. Ever. In my entire career." And his voice rose, driven by his bubbling anger. "In my entire career, I've never witnessed intentional collusion for the single and sole purpose of humiliating a fellow classmate. Your behavior was scandalous. Scandalous! Correct me if I'm wrong, but you people have entered this academy because you want to uphold our oath, to seek out new life and new civilizations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the fellow whom you just humiliated into leaving this room is, as far as you are concerned, a new life. The vast majority of you have never even met a Klingon. Yet you had the nerve to come in here with your prejudices and your predispositions and drive him away. What you just did was shocking and completely inappropriate for anyone who has any desire to serve in Starfleet." "Sir," Zach spoke up, "if I may, you didn't tell us that we couldn't focus on—" "Quiet, Mr. Kebron!" snapped Lipinski. "Don't insult my intelligence. We both know that this was no coincidence. This was a concerted effort, and I find it repulsive. Repulsive! And with the exceptions of Mr. Rozhenko and Mr. Tobias, I certainly hope that you people have no aversion to plenty of extra work, because I can guarantee you that that is what you have just brought yourselves." A low moan echoed through the class, and a number of angry stares were directed at Zach. That was more than enough to tell Lipinski just precisely who had been the organizer of the little stunt. But Zach didn't care, because he was hoping that maybe finally Worf was getting the message. With any luck, by tomorrow the Klingon would be long gone. For just a brief moment, he felt a flash of guilt, recalling the things that Tanya had said. But then he thought of what had happened in the self-defense class, and he remained convinced that he had done exactly the right thing. Worf Rozhenko was, quite simply, not the kind of cadet that Starfleet wanted or needed. Worf barreled down the corridor, pushing past any cadets who happened to get in his way. When they caught a look at Worf's angry expression, their immediate responses to the less than gentle treatment were quickly stifled. He burst out of the building, moving so quickly that the doors barely had time to open for him. In the mood that he was in, it was very likely that if the doors had not been open, he simply would have gone straight through them. He stood outside the academy and finally allowed himself to lean back against one of the great walls. He fought to slow the racing of his heart and the pounding of his pulse against his temple. He was not sure which he was more angry about, the fact that they had organized this charming little reminder of the hostile history of Klingon Federation relationships, or the fact that he had let them rattle him so. Rattle him? Who was he kidding? There's no point to this, none at all. If he had any brains in his head, he would head back to his quarters, pack his things, and be out the door for good before anyone came back from class. Of course he was a fighter. Of course he was tough. But through much of his life, whenever he had encountered suspicion and hostility, there had been a hope that somehow, somewhere, it might get better. Starfleet had crystallized that hope for him, and now it was all falling apart. What in the world was the reason for shoving himself into a situation where he was very clearly not wanted? He heard a soft footfall nearby him, and his head snapped around. He frowned in puzzlement at the intruder. It was a young man several years older than Worf, standing near the bushes. Worf could see that he was wearing some sort of odd eye gear, sunglasses perhaps. Maybe his eyes were particularly sensitive to the light. He was staring fixedly at Worf, standing several feet away. "What is the matter?" demanded Worf. The young man's head tilted slightly as if he were turning his head in the direction of Worf's voice. "I'm sorry. I hope this doesn't sound rude. You're not human, are you?" Worf opened his mouth in amazement and then closed it. "Are you joking?" "I don't think so." "I am a Klingon," he said incredulously. "What are you, blind?" The other man smiled lopsidedly. "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, from birth." He came around the bush, and now Worf saw to his chagrin that the young man was wearing an ensign uniform. He stuck out a hand. "I'm Geordie LaForge." "Worf," he replied, shaking the hand firmly. He stared at LaForge's face. "That device on your face,
It enables you to see?
After a fashion, said Geordi. I'm still getting used to it. It's called a visor. I see things a little differently than most people. That's why I was staring at you. I was picking up thermal readings from you that weren't even close to the norm.
No, said Worf, sounding dangerously close to self-pitying. Nothing about me is the norm. That is something that I'm very frequently reminded of.
Geordi tilted his head again, and Worf quickly realized that it was a reflex the Forge had developed through years of sightlessness. Sounds as if you're having some sort of problem, Worf. You're attending the academy, right?
First year,
Worf acknowledged. Geordi nodded. I just graduated. I'm waiting for my first posting. So what's the problem? Workload getting you down? Maybe a study group?
I am coping with the workload quite adequately, thank you. Your concern is appreciated. I will take up no more of your time.
Now, wait a minute.
Thank you, Mr. LaForge.
Worf started to walk away from the building, but Geordi called from behind him in a sharp and firm voice. Cadet, halt! Reflexively, even though he would have preferred to keep going, Worf stopped in his tracks. Geordi came up behind him, walking casually. Now, you want to tell me what the problem is?
With all due respect, sir, no. I can deal with the situation on my own.
Really? How are you planning to do that? By quitting? Worf looked at him in surprise.
Who told you that?
Geordi started down one of the paths. Let me guess. You're feeling alienated? Separate from your classmates?
They are making it difficult,
Worf acknowledged, falling in a step beside him. Yeah, well, there's no excuse for that, said Geordi readily. The only thing I can say to that is that the reason people come to the academy is to learn. And what you're learning here is a lot more than facts and figures, ship names and star dates. You're all learning a particular way of thinking. Look, Worf, was it? Worf nodded, and then realized he wasn't certain if the visor was subtle enough to detect such small gestures. So he said,
Yes,
almost as an afterthought. Worf, there's a lot of stuff that people think automatically. A lot of presumptions, a lot of built-in mechanisms. At Starfleet Academy, people are asked to unlearn many things that have been ground into us, almost from the time that our ancestors, or my ancestors at least, were squatting around the first fires looking nervously at the glowing eyes in the forest. And one of the most fundamental of those built-in mechanisms is that people are afraid of things that they don't understand. They're afraid because they think that the unknown could hurt them. The whole key to being a good Starfleet officer, continued LaForge, is not to be afraid of the unknown, but instead to embrace it, to be drawn to it, to study it, to be excited by it and want to share in its wonders. Believe it or not, that's not an easy transition to make. And in the midst of your classmates trying to make that transition to embracing the unknown, here you are. The unknown in the flesh. Worse than the unknown, they figure they know everything they need to know about Klingons, and they're nervous about what they do know.
You are not nervous, said Worf.
Geordi shrugged. Why should I be? We're at peace with the Klingon Empire. You're here at the academy, and I presume they wouldn't let you in unless they checked you out. So I doubt you're a crazed killer or anything. Are you? Worf actually smiled ever so slightly at the engaging tone in LaForge's voice.
Not to my knowledge.
Well then.
But I am different from them, said Worf. I think differently, act differently, and they
are students, Geordi reminded him. Still learning, still growing, just as you are, believe it or not. And just as they're going to come to learn about the special requirements of Klingons, you are going to come to the understanding that humans sometimes need special handling as well. Of course. He let his voice trail off. Trying to hide his impatience and not succeeding especially well, Worf said,
Of course what?
Well, as long as you're here, said Geordi, the cadets are having the opportunity to experience firsthand close up what a member of the proud Klingon species is like. You're breaking a lot of ice just by being here. If you could make them realize that Klingons are not the enemy, then you're doing a tremendous service to Klingons everywhere. How? He said, anticipating Worf's question. Because once your classmates graduate, they're going to be out on ships exploring the galaxy, and sooner or later they'll run into Klingons. Now, do you want to run the risk of their giving whatever Klingons they encounter a tough time because maybe they're carrying all their old fears with them? Or do you want them, through their exposure to you over the next few years, to overcome their prejudices toward Klingons, and as a result, be that much more likely to treat Klingons with the respect, dignity, and honor that they so richly deserve?
That is not fair,
Worf said, starting to feel a little angry.
You cannot put all on me the notion that my being here in the Academy is going to have significant impact on the future dealings with other Klingons.
I didn't intend to put anything on you, Geordi replied easily. All I'm doing is pointing out the likely way that things are going to occur. It strikes me that it would be the honorable thing for you to stay here and try to make life better for the Klingon species, but that's not my decision, is it? Worf scowled more darkly than he had in some time.
And to leave would be dishonorable, is that it?
You said that, not me. You just do what you feel you have to do. Nowhere is it written that you have to make me happy. Worf was silent for a moment, and then sighed very, very loudly. At that, Geordi smiled. Look, Mr. Worf, you're talking to one other guy at the Academy who really, truly knows what it's like to feel separate from the rest of the world. You and I, we're pretty much alike. We both see things that in ways that the rest of the people around us don't. You view them through the eyes of a Klingon born to respect honor and strength and a variety of other virtues. And I view the world, well, my way. It's lonely as anything, but it doesn't have to be that way. Not if you're willing to let people in or let yourself out. Worf nodded. At that, Geordi clapped him on the back. Then, as an afterthought, he added, Are you going on the Prometheus run? Worf looked up in confusion.
But what?
Routine stuff, said Geordi. Prometheus is the artificial satellite at the outer end of the solar rim, the one that serves as a first alert station in case of attack. It's all automated, but Starfleet likes to send a group of cadets out there once a year to run various routine checks. Upperclassmen always pick the away team. I know a guy on the committee. I could recommend you for it. What's your specialty?
Majoring in security, minoring in operations, said Worf.
Actually, he hadn't really decided his specialties yet. That simply sounded like a good combination. Okay, it's basic stuff pretty much, but it's a chance to get out in space. And after all, that's really what it's all about, isn't it?
Yes, sir,
said Worf quickly. It's been a pleasure meeting you, Cadet Worf.
The same to you, sir.
Worf stood there and watched Geordi LaForge head back into the Academy. Of all the humans that Worf had ever encountered, he decided at that very moment that Ensign Geordi LaForge was probably among the most unique. He was almost sad about the fact that LaForge would be gone soon. He wondered if he would ever see him again. Chapter 10. A week later, an early rising sun over San Francisco found a dozen cadets assembled at the shuttle pad for the Prometheus run. Although it had been a few weeks since Worf had arrived on this very landing pad, to a certain extent it seemed as if it was just yesterday. It was difficult to believe that so much had happened to him in such a brief period of time. For that matter, it was hard for him to believe that he was still there. He was annoyed that he had allowed himself to fall so thoroughly for what that ensign had been saying. LaForge had boxed Worf in. He could see that now, phrased things in such a way that he had absolutely no choice in the matter. He'd made him feel that if he walked out of the Academy now, he'd be hurting the entire Klingon Empire. So he was going to hang around, at least until they threw him out. The air was a little nippy that morning, and a stiff breeze was blowing in from the ocean. It filled the air with a nautical sense, and for a moment Worf felt a connection with explorers from centuries ago, back when they braved not the stars and sky-spanning metal ships, but the oceans, and vessels made of creaking wood, held together with ancient devices called nails. What kind of men must they have been, those adventurers? Although there was so much about the mysteries of space that remained unknown, still, there was much of which they were already quite aware. But what of those first explorers who grew up in a society that taught them that the world was flat? The dragons lived at the edges, prepared to devour any unwary explorer who dared trespass. What must they have been like, those explorers? Insane! He turned as he heard the comments from other students who were now gathering around the shuttle. It was Briggs who had been speaking, muttering to himself, "It's insane to have us up and about at this hour." Worf was pleased to see the other members of his study group among the cadets who were embarking on the mission. It wasn't particularly surprising. The members of this crew were chosen from the higher grade achievers in the academy. The study group, working as smoothly and efficiently as Simon had planned, had easily fallen into that rank. Worf might have had his difficulties when it came to socializing, but as far as academics was concerned, he didn't have to hang his head in shame. There was Salida, who would probably look self-possessed and prepared even in the middle of the night. Tanya Tobias was rubbing the sleep out of her eyes, but otherwise seemed fairly prepared for the day's activities. Mark McHenry was distracted, as always. Worf doubted that Mark had any problem with the early hour. He had once mentioned that he rarely slept because he was always finding more interesting things to do. When asked about such biological needs as the dream sleep that was required for the psychological health of a human being, Mark had simply replied, "Oh, I do that while I'm awake." No one had the nerve to pursue the matter further. For that matter, no one doubted him. Zach Keebran was up and around. The Brickar had been snoring soundly that morning when Worf got up. Deep down, Worf had hoped that Zach would sleep right through the intended liftoff of the mission. He should have known that that was too much to hope for. When the roster for the Prometheus run had been posted earlier that week, Worf had almost expected a wave of protest when it was noted that his name was up there. Such did not occur, however. Starfleet cadets, it appeared, were made of stronger stuff than that. The extra work from Professor Lepisky had probably stifled most thoughts of rebellion. But neither, however, were they going to go to any effort to make him feel welcome. When Worf had returned to his quarters after his talk with Geordi LaForge, Zach had been seated at his desk studying and barely glanced up upon Worf's entrance.
"Oh, still here?" he'd asked.
He did not seem angry or frustrated or glad or anything. It was simply an acknowledgement of the continued state of Worf's presence. And that was very much what Worf had gotten from a number of other students over the next few days, an air of, "Oh, still here." No one was going to raise a fist to him, but neither was anyone going to lend him a hand. There were other cadets here as well, talking animatedly with one another. They were bustling with varying degrees of excitement over their first mission, routine though it might be. And there was Simon. Worf stared at him. He had not seen Simon for some days now. Simon had been skipping their customary meals together, saying he preferred to eat in his room, or not at all. Worf knew he had been burying himself in work, spending many additional hours going over and over various texts. Driven, Worf was sure, by the insatiable need to succeed beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. He'd even missed a couple of study groups, pleading exhaustion and stating that he was probably coming down with something. Worf had been a bit concerned, at first, but he knew Simon was always going to be the type of person who was driven to produce beyond anything that anyone could rationally expect. That was part of what made Simon the born leader that he was, Worf had thought. Still, not having seen Simon for a while, Worf felt some small measure of concern upon running into him now. He did not seem quite as robust as he usually did. His eyes had a slightly hollow look, as if he hadn't been sleeping particularly well as of late. He had definitely lost weight. Nothing that made him look unhealthy, but enough to catch Worf's attention.
"Simon,"
he said in a low voice.
"are you all right?"
Simon smiled gamely. "You know me," he said. "I'm not at my best early in the morning." Worf certainly did know him, and he knew that Simon was perfectly tip-top early in the morning. All the time they lived on the farm on Galt, early rising had been the norm. Before he could inquire further, however, there was a brisk clapping of hands, and a voice called out, "All right, cadets, on board." The shuttlecraft was sitting there, covered with a fine morning dew. The loading door had opened up, and from it emerged the self-defense teacher, Commander Clark. He clapped his hands together briskly and said, "You're not accomplishing anything just by standing around here. Let's do it." Immediately, the cadets clambered on board. They were full of enthusiasm and excitement. This was the sort of thing they'd been training for. Worf sat next to a window, keeping the seat next to him open for Simon, But to his surprise, his brother sat in the next row up, also next to the window. He leaned against it, staring out, and for just the briefest of moments, Worf thought he saw an expression of bleak helplessness on Simon's face. But then it vanished as quickly as it had been there, and Worf told himself that he'd imagined it. Tanya leaned over to Worf and said, "Anyone sitting here?" She pointed to the empty aisle seat next to him. Worf stared at the seat.
"If they are, they're very well camouflaged,"
he replied. Tanya laughed and dropped into the seat next to Worf. "How about that?" she said. "Worf actually made a joke."
"A joke?"
he said.
"Oh, I was serious, actually."
She sighed. "You're always serious. What makes a Klingon laugh?"
"Human beings in pain."
She stared at him and paled slightly.
"That was a joke," he told her. "Was it a good one?"
"Not particularly, no."
"Oh."
He looked a little crestfallen.
"I was attempting dark irony. I did not succeed."
"Keep working on it." He sighed.
"That's what my parents tell me. The human notion of humor is a very curious thing."
"That's for sure," she admitted. Clark was seated in the pilot's seat. He swiveled in his seat and called back to the cadets. "Everyone strap in. We have a schedule to keep, so we're going to be lifting off fast." They did so. As Worf snapped the buckle in tight, he noticed that Mark McHenry was sitting across the aisle. He wore an expression of such unbridled excitement that Worf was moved to ask,
"What is the matter?"
Mark replied, "I just can't believe it, that's all. This is my first time going into deep space." Tanya and Worf stared at him incredulously. "Your first time?" Tanya asked. "You've never gone far off planet before? Even on a family vacation or some such?" He shook his head. "My schooling was entirely on Earth. And as for vacations, my father always said, 'Why go to all the trouble and expense of leaving Earth when there are hollow parlors for a fraction of the cost and aggravation?' Which I guess was true enough. Still," Worf shook his head,
"It sounds very limiting to me."
"Me too," Mark said confidentially, as if afraid that somehow his father, wherever he might be, might hear him. "And again, my father always said I had way too much space between my ears anyway. I don't know what he meant by that, do you?" Worf and Tanya exchanged a look.
"No,"
they said together. The engines of the shuttlecraft roared, and faster than Mark would have believed, the craft lifted off the pad. It hurtled skyward. From where they were sitting, they could see through the portals the ground dwindling below them. Large puffy clouds floated in front of them, and then, in the blink of an eye, they were through the clouds and out of the atmosphere, where the blackness of space enveloped them. "Stars!" breathed Tanya, amazed. "Look at them."
"What about them?"
asked Worf. "I'm always surprised that they're not twinkling."
"Of course not,"
Worf said reasonably.
"Twinkling is caused by the distortion of the starlight as it passes through the planetary atmosphere, since—"
"Worf."
"Yes, Tanya?"
"Be quiet." She was busy, gazing in wonderment. "Just be quiet." They hurtled through space. The cadets continued to talk, but there was none of the loose bantering that had marked their earlier conversations. Instead, their voices were low and even a little unsure. "Nervous, Worf?" The question came from Zach Kebron, who was seated behind Worf. Worf was surprised. He couldn't remember the last time that Zach had addressed him in a manner that was anything other than deliberately irritating.
"No. Should I be?"
"Well," Zach said easily, "here we are, out in space, heading toward the Prometheus satellite. Should be a standard mission, but you never know. This is the exact kind of situation they're always telling us about at the Academy, where all of us have to depend on one another. Aren't you the least bit nervous about your well-being depending upon a bunch of non-Klingons?" Worf was about to reply, but abruptly Simon spun in his chair, propping himself up on one knee, and turning to look over Worf in Zach's direction. And when he spoke, his voice was unexpectedly brittle and harsh.
"Cut it out, Kebron,"
he almost snarled. "You have been on him since the day he got here, and it's enough. He's doing his best. We're all doing our best, and if that's not good enough for you, then you can—" "I can what?" asked Zach calmly. Commander Clark half-turned in his seat. "That's enough back there. If you're interested in conducting yourselves in a civil manner, that's fine. If you're going to bicker, kindly keep it to yourselves. Understood? There were murmurs of, yes, sir, and the shuttle lapsed into silence. Worf leaned forward and whispered, Simon, you did not have to. Just enjoy the view, Worf, Simon replied, sounding old and tired. Worf and Tanya glanced at each other but said nothing. The rest of the trip was fairly uneventful. At last, Clark called out, All right, cadets, prepare for arrival. They all strained their eyes, seeing nothing at first, but then finally they spotted the station. It appeared small at first, but grew with amazing speed. It gave them a real feeling for just how fast they were traveling, that something could seem so far away and be upon them so soon. As if reading their minds, Clark commented, In the early days of space travel, a manned journey like this one would have been impossible due to fuel considerations, and even if they somehow had enough fuel, it would have taken months for them to cover the distance that we have in under an hour. Count yourselves lucky that you were born when you were, because if you hadn't been, then my mother might still be pregnant with me, Mark offered deadpan. 18 years. Wow, that'd be a record, I think. As was always the case with Mark, it was impossible to tell whether he was kidding or not. So no one tried. Ahead of them hung Prometheus Station. It was old by any standard, having been there for decades, a living relic of the earliest days of the Federation. Back then, the coming together of different civilizations seemed far more a matter of mutual protection from hostility than the forum for informed, intelligent, and non-belligerent interaction that it had evolved into. Completely automated, the Prometheus Station defense system and detection devices had really become outmoded. If it had been decommissioned and broken down for scrap, the odds were that it would have made no difference to its security, not with the long-range sensor capabilities that Earth itself now possessed. But Prometheus was regarded as something of a historical landmark, and so it was maintained, kept up as a link with the rugged beginnings of the United Federation of Planets. Prometheus Station was shaped like a giant top, with a large spiral encircling it that served as energy conduits. The shuttlecraft angled toward it, and Clark punched an entry code into the communications grid. Prometheus sat there for a moment, as if digesting this unexpected morsel of information. Then the ponderous shuttle bay door at the top opened. It seemed to take forever to do so. Yet another indicator of the age of the station. Eventually it did open fully, and Clark guided the shuttle in with practiced ease. The shuttle bay was so ancient that it did not have the force field that maintained an atmosphere while the doors were open. The cadets had to sit in the shuttle until the doors cycled shut and the atmospheric balance was restored once more. Then Clark got up to face them. You all have your assigned duties, he said. Thorough check of all maintenance systems, weapons systems, detection systems. The station has 6 levels, and there are 12 of you. Simple math will tell you that you should be able to go through this in record time. Check for any current systems malfunctions and, more important, locate any lapses that could possibly lead to problems down the road. I want detailed reports of everything that you find. I will be stationed at the command core if there is any problem. Are your communications links online? They each tapped the insignia communicator badge that had been issued them for the mission. Each heard a confirming beep beep upon touching it, and they all nodded affirmation. Excellent. All right, cadets. You received your assignments before we left Earth. Carry them out. The exit door hissed open, and one by one, the cadets filed out into the great shuttle bay of Prometheus Station.